I have a dream, that's all I need. I'll make it happen with some work and belief. Know what I want, so I'll take it on. I've made mistakes, but mistakes make you strong.
Hi, I'm JB. In this video, we're going to take a look at one of the most used metrics to assess a stock or a company and if it's worth looking into. Actually, a lot of people use this metric alone to base their decision to buy, and that's where I'm saying be careful. Today, we're going to look into the PE ratio, and I usually call it the P ratio because it's really, you know what I mean.
Those are pretty useless.
In this video, I'm going to cover why the PE ratio is useless and why it's only discussed by mainstream media to make you trade more. So, we're going to cover what is the PE ratio? How could you use the PE ratio? Why should you not use the PE ratio? Examples and quiz time, and what can we use instead? Let's get into it. 1. What is the PE ratio? The PE ratio, or the price to earnings ratio, is a metric that some people use to judge if a company is overvalued or undervalued. Usually, this is the retail investor who's fairly new to investing. Oh, now why did I say that? Well, if you know accounting and how to read and understand financial statements, you know how many shenanigans and accounting tricks companies use to either boost their earnings or to deflate them, whichever suits their needs. Charlie Munger said several times that the most companies report bullshit earnings, and if you read Benjamin Graham's book, The Intelligent Investor, he has a phrase in it that says, "Don't take a single year's earnings seriously." And he was quite right.
How anybody can turn that into something they use as a metric that talks about earnings is beyond me. Charlie?
Yeah, I think you would understand any presentation using the word EBITDA if every time you saw that word, you just substituted the phrase bullshit earnings. Oh, it says what remaining big accounting troubles exist. The real Lollapalooza is pension fund accounting and to some extent post-retirement medical liabilities.
And they just aren't facing up to reality at all, and they don't want to because they don't want to take the hit. It's amazing what people with high IQs will do to rationalize their own pocketbooks.
It's such a rotten way to run a civilization, to make the basic accounting wrong. It is very much like making the engineering wrong when you're building a bridge.
No one should look at a snapshot of a company earnings, like the PE ratio, and use that for anything. We need to look over a longer period of time and estimate the future. PE ratio is earnings per share, EPS, divided by the current share price. And it tells us how much investors are willing to pay for the company's earnings. There are many types of PE ratios, but usually two are used. It's the trailing 12 months and the forward-looking one, or the leading one. The 12-month trailing PE uses the last 12 months of reported earnings. Note, I said reported. We'll get back to this one later. And the forward-looking or leading PE uses future earnings guidance rather than past performance figures. Sometimes it's called estimated price to earnings. Well, maybe you already figured out why PE is almost completely useless when I mentioned how it's calculated. Maybe price as in stock price, as in the current price, which can be whatever the market think it is, whatever the hype is, whatever the, sentiment in the stock market is. It's very seldom that a stock is priced at a correct value. And also, the earnings part. Well, yeah, we're going to get into that later, but how we as a company can report our earnings, it's crazy. And think about it. Could there be times when the stock market is irrational and prices have been pushed higher by other investors or sentiments or the likes? Could we be in a bad time where a company needs to present better results than they actually have just to ride out some problems in the market? Yeah, I think so. So, the inherent problems with the PE ratio, we'll discuss this later. For now, let's see if we really can use the PE ratio for anything. Well, seeing that the PE is derived from earnings, which can be somewhat dubious, and a stock price that can be even more crazy at times, we must realize that the PE ratio holds the most value when it's compared against similar companies at the same time, in the same industry, or, even better, for a single company across a period of time. This brings us to the next point. How should you use the PE ratio? If you feel the need to find stocks using the PE ratio, it's really not a good idea. As I mentioned, it's almost a useless indicator on its own, so to improve it, we need some more information. Remember, we're only using it to screen a company or a stock we want to dive deeper into. That's why we could use the PE ratio over time, or together with expected growth of the company, and we have a PEG ratio. Price to earnings growth ratio. Peter Lynch mentions this in his book One Up on Wall Street, that because PE ratio doesn't take company growth into consideration, you should at least use the PEG ratio instead. The PEG ratio is PE ratio divided by the company's earnings growth rate. Let's look at Coca-Cola, for instance. Their PE ratio today is around 28. The company's earnings growth rate is, according to past performance and their own guidance, around 5.5%. That makes 28 divided by 5.5 equals 5.09 PEG ratio. Peter Lynch is very clear. If the PEG ratio equals 1, the company is fairly valued. If it's below 1, the company is undervalued. If it's over 1, the company is overvalued. So, at present time, Coca-Cola is overvalued if we use the PEG ratio. But seeing that the PE ratio is flawed from the get-go, then this metric really doesn't give a good picture for the company either. And as Warren Buffett always says, if you don't know the intrinsic value of a company and can make a qualified estimation of their future earnings, then you can't buy the stock. That's why we can only use the PE ratio for the company over time to see where they are now, and you can compare the PE with similar companies over time. But remember, you have no idea if those two companies have used the same bullshit earnings, or one uses clean numbers and the other one doesn't. That's why over time, you're a bit more safe. What is Coca-Cola PE over time? Here I use macro trends. Let's take a look at it. And as you can see, the PE ratio seems a bit high. It should be around 24. Remember, the average PE for the S&P 500 is around 22. 3. Why should you never use the PE ratio? Well, we already talked a little about that, so I'm just going to run through some of the worst problems with the PE ratio. It's a snapshot. Snapshot right now at this moment. What's the price? What's the so-called reported earnings? Earnings could be bullshit, as Charlie Munger says. Companies can use marketing power and do whatever it takes just to increase their earnings. I mean, I've seen companies make some kind of marketing promotions where they told that this was growth for the company, and it really wasn't. Another one is that growth is not factored in, and you can't compare PE from a tech company to a bank, for instance. They're completely different markets, completely different earnings. Even if you compare two companies in the same sector, what if you compare Apple versus Microsoft? What if they're both overvalued? Right now, investors think Apple is a better buy, so they're driving up the price. That's why a snapshot is useless.
Those are pretty useless.
There's a good article on Investopedia about how companies inflate or deflate earnings. But I have a good example from the company I work for. A lot of people are paid for performance, and when the salary and bonus depends on a certain level of earning, we sometimes sell a service which we will perform over the next 6 months, but we take the earnings right now, right here. This way I get my bonus and it looks very good on the company. We made some great earnings, but we just kind of, in Denmark we call it peed in our pants. We got warm in about 10 minutes and in a half an hour we have a problem. In order to beat the estimated PE when the next quarter's earnings are announced, Companies sometimes overstate their own estimate and later adjust it going into the next earnings announcement. So the leading PE can be even worse. Okay, let's look at some examples. Which stock is a better buy? And let's say they're in the same type of business just to make it easier. We have company A has a PE ratio of 5. We have company B, PE ratio of 20. What is the answer to this one? We have no idea. We don't have enough information. If we add at least the expected earnings growth, we know a bit more. Company A grows 2% a year. Company B grows 25% a year. Now we can use the PEG ratio, the PEG ratio. PE ratio of 5 divided by 2% growth equals 2.5 PEG ratio. This company is overvalued. Company B, it was 25% growth, a PE ratio of 20, that's 20 divided by 25, that's 0.8. This company is undervalued. So even if company B has a high PE ratio compared to company A, it's still a better deal. The growth is very, very important. What about new products and services? What about future income streams? What about dividends? What about buybacks? Well, this is why an investor should never buy a company before we do our due diligence, and we have looked deeper into the company, the financials, the expected growth, etc. I like to use the discounted cash flow calculation to determine a company's value, and together with all the other metrics, I determine if a company is a good investment. You can see my video about when to buy a stock right here. So, what can we use instead of PE? Well, I believe nothing can stand alone. We need to know a lot more than just a snapshot of the current value. We also need to have a good idea of the future growth and possible risks. As I mentioned, I start with the story of the company, then I look into the financials. Future growth and possible revenue and earnings, much more interesting. For me, it's the amount of free cash flow that's the determining factor. And when the free cash flow gets better every year, and there's a nice growth, that's what I like to see. For more inspiration, see my video on when to buy a stock. And on that note, I will end the video, but before I do, I hope you could do me a solid and hit the like button and maybe even subscribe. It's free. You might just find some value in another one of my videos. The more you learn, the more you earn. Bye.
I have a dream, that's all I need. I'll make it happen with some work and belief. Know what I want, so I'll take it on. I've made mistakes, but mistakes make you strong. Let's break it down for a minute. I want the crown, I'm gon' get it. You hear me loud, man, I'm winning. Yeah, Charlie Sheen will be grinning. These ladies know that I'm sinning, and this is just the beginning. I'm closing in the ninth inning, there ain't no point in resisting.